September 15th, 1944, 0500 hours. The destroyer USS Robinson sliced through the dark waters off Peleliu, her 5-inch guns trained toward a beach that intelligence said was ready to die. Through the scratched plexiglass of the bridge, Commander Earl Mayer watched the pre-invasion bombardment reach its crescendo. 5 battleships and 3 cruisers were pounding the tiny coral island from 8,000 yards offshore, their shells creating mountains of smoke and coral dust that obscured everything. It looked like total annihilation. It looked like nothing could survive. Mayer had seen enough pre-invasion bombardments to know that looking devastating and being devastating were 2 entirely different things. In 3 hours, Marines would storm those beaches, expecting the naval guns to have done their job. The question that haunted every naval gunner in the Pacific was always the same. Were we actually hitting anything? The mathematics of destruction were straightforward when you fired at enemy ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Rangefinders measured distance, fire control computers calculated trajectories, radar tracked targets through smoke and darkness. The sophisticated Mark 37 director system could put shells on target at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards. Against maneuvering warships, this technology was revolutionary. Against concrete bunkers hidden in coral ridges, it was nearly useless. The Japanese on Peleliu had spent 6 months building fortifications that conventional naval doctrine couldn't touch. 500 caves and bunkers honeycombed the island's interior. Reinforced concrete casemates protected artillery and machine guns. Steel doors slid open to fire, then closed before American spotters could identify the position. The Umabrogol ridges rose 300 feet above sea level, their slopes bristling with interconnected defensive positions that American pre-war planners had dismissed as low-rolling hills. Everything the Navy believed about shore bombardment was about to collide with a simple truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge. You cannot destroy what you cannot see. And firing from 8,000 yards through mountains of smoke and coral dust, the battleships and cruisers couldn't see anything. The transformation had begun 9 months earlier, not in the conference rooms of Pearl Harbor or the planning cells of Admiral Nimitz's headquarters, but on a muddy beach at Salerno, Italy, where American troops were dying because German tanks had broken through to the waterline. September 13th, 1943. The invasion of mainland Italy had turned into a bloodbath. German panzers were counterattacking with such ferocity that the entire Fifth Army beachhead faced collapse. Artillery ashore couldn't stop them. Air support was grounded by weather. The cruisers and battleships firing from 10,000 yards offshore were landing shells everywhere, except on the German positions that mattered. Rear Admiral Richard Connolly watched the disaster developing from the bridge of USS Biscayne. A destroyer division commander who had won the Navy Cross in the First World War, Connolly understood that the sophisticated fire control systems his ships carried were designed to fight other ships at maximum range, not to provide precision fire support for troops in desperate trouble. The German tanks were now less than 2 miles from the beach. In minutes, they would reach the waterline and the invasion would fail. Connolly grabbed the radio himself. He ordered Biscayne, his command ship mounting only 2 5-inch guns, to close on the beach, not to 8,000 yards, not to 5,000 yards. He ordered his helmsman to bring the ship within 1,000 yards of the shoreline, so close that every man on the bridge could see the German tank commanders in their cupolas. At that range, fire control computers were irrelevant. At that range, you aimed the guns like rifles. The 5-inch rounds found their target immediately. The first salvo struck the lead panzer, penetrating the thinner side armor and igniting the ammunition. The second salvo hit a supporting tank. The third walked across a German infantry position, killing the soldiers before they could advance. Biscayne stayed on station for 40 minutes, trading accuracy for vulnerability, engaging targets that the big guns firing from safe distances couldn't hit. When she finally withdrew, the German counterattack had stalled. The beachhead held. That single action gave Richard Connolly a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his naval career, Close-in Connolly. But more importantly, it began a doctrinal revolution in how the United States Navy employed gunfire support. The lessons of Salerno forced a question that naval gunners had been avoiding since Guadalcanal. What if the solution to ineffective shore bombardment wasn't better computers or bigger guns? What if the solution was getting closer? The pre-war doctrine for naval gunfire support had been developed during exercises where safety was paramount and casualties were unacceptable. Ships fired from comfortable distances. Spotters called corrections. Gun crews adjusted and fired again in a methodical process that worked perfectly when nobody was shooting back and time didn't matter. But every amphibious assault from Tarawa to Saipan had demonstrated that this doctrine failed when it encountered reality. At Tarawa in November 1943, 3 battleships and 4 cruisers had bombarded Betio Island for 3 hours before the Marines landed. Intelligence estimated over 500 Japanese bunkers defended the tiny atoll. The Navy brass briefed their commanders with absolute confidence. One admiral told his peers before the battle, "Gentlemen, we will not neutralize Betio Island. We will obliterate it." The Marines who hit the beach discovered that obliteration meant something very different from what the Navy thought it meant. The concrete bunkers were intact. The machine guns were operational. The defenders were very much alive and fighting. More than 1,000 Marines became casualties on the first day. The post-battle analysis was devastating. Naval gunfire from long range had created impressive explosions and massive smoke. It had thrown coral and sand into the air by the ton. It had made a spectacular show that looked lethal from the ships. But out of 500 bunkers, only 17 had been destroyed. The mathematics were simple and brutal. High-velocity naval shells fired from long range hit the ground at steep angles. Against dug-in positions, especially those protected by overhead cover, the shells either buried themselves in coral before exploding or skipped over the target entirely. The Japanese understood this vulnerability and designed their defenses accordingly. Bunkers had thick overhead protection, but thin or non-existent walls facing the ocean. To destroy them required shells to enter through the firing aperture or to strike the exposed side walls. That required direct fire, not indirect bombardment. Direct fire meant line of sight. Line of sight meant getting close. Getting close meant abandoning the safety of long range and bringing warships within range of every weapon the enemy possessed. It violated every principle of naval tactics. It exposed ships to shore batteries that could punch through destroyer hulls with single shots. It put vessels in shallow water where maneuverability was limited and navigation was treacherous. Most dangerously, it meant operating close enough to see the enemy with the naked eye, which meant the enemy could see you. No naval commander wanted to risk his ship unnecessarily. The spectre of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya in December 1941, haunted every decision about where to position warships near hostile shores. Ships were expensive. Ships took years to build. Losing a cruiser to shore batteries while supporting a landing meant that cruiser wouldn't be available for the next operation or the one after that. Better to fire from safe distances and let the Marines deal with whatever survived. But the Marines were dying. They were dying because bunkers that looked destroyed from 8,000 yards were fully functional at ground level. They were dying because artillery positions that spotters reported as neutralized opened fire as soon as the first landing craft hit the beach. They were dying because the Navy's shore bombardment doctrine prioritized ship safety over support effectiveness. The breaking point came at Kwajalein in February 1944. Admiral Connolly, now commanding the assault force for the northern objectives, decided to do ashore what he had done at Salerno. He would bring his battleships in close, not just his destroyers, his battleships. He ordered the old battleships Tennessee, Maryland, and Colorado to close to 2,000 yards from Roy Namur, close enough that their crews could see individual palm trees on the beach. The battleship officers were horrified. 2,000 yards was point-blank range for any competent shore battery. If the Japanese had heavy coastal guns, they could cripple or sink a battleship with a few well-aimed salvos. The risk seemed insane, but Connolly had calculated something that changed the equation. By the time the battleships closed to 2,000 yards, carrier aircraft would have suppressed or destroyed any coastal artillery capable of engaging them. What remained would be the fortifications that mattered most, the bunkers and pillboxes that would kill Marines. Against those targets, 2,000 yards was perfect. The results exceeded every expectation. When battleship guns fired from 2,000 yards, the entire crew could watch the shells impact. Not through optical rangefinders and spotting scopes, but with their naked eyes. They could see the shells enter bunker, firing ports. They could see concrete walls disintegrate. They could watch ammunition stores explode and enemy positions collapse. Most importantly, when a target was still operational after a salvo, the gun crew could immediately adjust and fire again, walking their shells across the position until it was confirmed destroyed. The accuracy improvement was staggering. Shells that would have missed by 50 or 100 yards when fired from 8,000 yards were hitting within 15 feet of aim point from 2,000 yards. The flat trajectory at close range meant shells struck walls and apertures instead of roofs and ground. Fire control became instinctive instead of mathematical. Gun captains aimed by eye, using landmarks and terrain features instead of computed coordinates. If you could see your target clearly enough to describe it to a spotter, you could hit it. Kwajalein proved the concept worked, but it raised a harder question. Battleships were heavily armoured and could survive hits from shore batteries. Cruisers had some protection, but destroyers, the workhorses of naval gunfire support, had hulls measured in fractions of an inch. A single shell from a Japanese 75mm gun could cripple a destroyer. A hit to the magazine or engineering spaces could sink one in minutes. Asking destroyer crews to steam within 1,000 yards of fortified positions seemed suicidal. The destroyer captains disagreed. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, destroyer commanders who had participated in shore bombardments at Saipan, Guam, and Tinian began experimenting with ultra-close range direct fire techniques. They discovered something that the battleship commanders hadn't fully appreciated. At ranges under 2,000 yards, destroyers had advantages that big ships couldn't match. They were faster. They were more maneuverable. They drew less water, allowing them to operate in shallows where cruisers and battleships couldn't follow. Most importantly, destroyers could bring their guns to bear on targets that larger ships couldn't engage. A cruiser firing from 4,000 yards had to elevate its guns to clear the beach. That elevation angle made it nearly impossible to hit bunkers tucked into hillsides or positions hidden behind ridges. But a destroyer at 800 yards could fire almost horizontally, putting shells through firing ports that were invisible from longer ranges. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, became a precision bunker-busting weapon when fired in local control at close range. Local control was the key. The Mark 37 fire control system was a marvel of analog computing. It could calculate trajectories for moving targets at ranges of 10,000 yards while compensating for wind, roll, pitch, and a dozen other variables. But at 800 yards, all that sophistication became a liability. By the time the computer calculated a firing solution, the target coordinates would have changed and the solution would be obsolete. What the gun crews needed wasn't computation, it was speed. Local control meant the gun captain aimed his weapon using only the telescopic sight mounted on the gun itself. No computers, no directors, no remote coordination with other guns. The gun captain simply looked through the sight, identified his target, and fired when the crosshairs aligned. It was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. A well-trained gun crew in local control could identify a target, aim, fire, and observe impact in less than 30 seconds. If the first shot missed, they could correct and fire again immediately. The technique required nerve that bordered on recklessness. Destroyer captains had to bring their ships within range of every weapon the enemy possessed, then hold position long enough for the gun crews to identify and destroy targets. They had to trust that their speed and maneuverability would keep them alive while they fought at ranges where even machine gun fire could kill sailors on exposed decks. They had to accept that getting close enough to guarantee hits meant getting close enough to guarantee return fire. September 15th, 1944, Peleliu, 0830 hours. The Marines were scheduled to hit the beach in 30 minutes. Commander Mayer brought Robinson to within 1,000 yards of the invasion beaches and slowed to 5 knots, just enough speed for steerage. His 5-inch guns locked onto targets identified by fire control parties who had landed minutes earlier with the reconnaissance teams. A Japanese bunker at the northern end of White Beach was pouring machine gun fire across the landing zone. The bunker had survived the pre-invasion bombardment completely intact. From 8,000 yards, it had been invisible in the smoke. From 1,000 yards, Mayer could see the firing port with his binoculars. He ordered his guns into local control and identified the target to his gun captains. Mount 51, the forward dual gun mount, trained toward the bunker. The gun captain, a chief petty officer named James Mulcahy, looked through his sight and saw what Mayer described, a concrete structure at the base of a coral outcropping, firing port clearly visible, range estimated at 1,100 yards. Mulcahy loaded armor-piercing rounds and aimed directly at the firing port. He waited for the ship's roll to bring the crosshairs into alignment and squeezed the trigger. The 5-inch shell crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds. It entered the bunker through the firing port and detonated inside the position. The explosion blew out the back wall and silenced the machine gun. Mulcahy's second shot hit the same aperture 3 seconds later, collapsing the remaining structure. Total engagement time from target identification to confirmed destruction was 12 seconds. At 8,000 yards with indirect fire, destroying that bunker would have required minutes of adjustment and dozens of shells. At 1,000 yards with direct fire, 2 shells and 12 seconds, Robinson worked up and down the beach for the next 40 minutes, her gun crews destroying one target after another. Bunkers, pillboxes, artillery positions, machine gun nests, anything that could threaten the Marines got a 5-inch shell through the firing port. The gun captains developed a rhythm, a brutal efficiency born of practice and desperation. Identify target, aim, fire, observe impact, adjust if necessary, fire again, move to next target. The Japanese fought back. Shore batteries that had survived the long-range bombardment engaged Robinson with everything they possessed. 75mm shells churned the water around the destroyer. Machine gun fire raked her decks. A 47mm anti-tank gun scored a hit on her superstructure, but the shell passed through thin plating without exploding. Robinson's speed and constant maneuvering kept her alive. Mayer never held course longer than 30 seconds, zigging and zagging continuously to throw off enemy aim while his gun crews fired with methodical precision. When the first wave of Marines hit the beach at 0900 hours, they found the landing zone largely clear. The bunkers that should have slaughtered them were ruins. The machine gun positions were silent. The artillery that should have been dropping shells into the landing craft was destroyed. Marines who had survived Tarawa and Saipan couldn't believe what they were seeing. For the first time in their experience, the Navy's pre-landing bombardment had actually worked. The difference wasn't bigger shells or more fire control technology. The difference was range. Robinson and the other destroyers working close to shore had proven that destroying fortifications required putting your gun sights on the target and firing until it stopped shooting back. There was no mathematical formula that could replace that level of direct engagement. No fire control computer could substitute for a gun captain who could see his target and adjust his aim based on observed results. But Peleliu also revealed the terrible cost of getting close. Throughout that first day, destroyers working inshore took heavy fire. USS Benion was hit by shore batteries and forced to withdraw with casualties. USS Bailey took multiple hits from machine guns, killing 3 sailors on exposed gun mounts. USS Guest was struck by a 75mm shell that penetrated her hull and flooded 2 compartments. These weren't glancing blows or near misses. These were direct hits from enemy weapons that could reach targets at 800 to 1,000 yards. The question facing naval commanders became stark. Was the increased accuracy worth the increased risk? Every destroyer lost to shore batteries was a ship that couldn't support the next invasion. Every sailor killed by enemy fire at close range was a man who couldn't fight in future engagements. The mathematics of war demanded a calculation that no one wanted to make. Admiral Richmond Turner, commanding the amphibious forces in the Central Pacific, made the calculation. He assembled his destroyer commanders after Peleliu and asked them directly, should we continue close-range direct fire or return to long-range indirect bombardment? If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The answer was unanimous. Every destroyer captain who had fought at close range voted to continue the tactic. Their reasoning was simple. Destroyers that got close took more damage, but Marines supported by close-range fire took fewer casualties, and every Marine who survived the beach meant faster progress inland, which meant shorter campaigns and fewer total casualties for everyone. The debate ended when the casualty statistics arrived from Peleliu. Marines supported by close-range naval gunfire suffered 30% fewer casualties during the initial landing phase than Marines in previous operations supported by long-range bombardment. The number was impossible to ignore. Close-range direct fire saved lives. That single fact overrode every other consideration. But accepting the tactic and perfecting it were different challenges. Throughout October and November of 1944, destroyer squadrons developed training programs specifically focused on close-range gunnery. They practiced at Kahulawe Island off Hawaii, bringing their ships within 1,000 yards of the beach and engaging simulated targets under realistic conditions. Gun captains learned to identify bunkers by their firing ports, to distinguish artillery positions from supply dumps, to recognize the difference between reinforced concrete and simple earthworks. The training revealed problems that nobody had anticipated. At 8,000 yards, a gun captain aimed at map coordinates relayed from a fire control party ashore. At 1,000 yards, that same gun captain was looking at terrain features and trying to match them with verbal descriptions radioed from Marines under fire. The disconnect between what spotters saw from ground level and what gun crews saw from ship level created confusion that cost precious seconds. Seconds that could mean the difference between destroying a bunker and allowing it to kill Marines. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marine forward observers began using colored smoke grenades to mark targets. A white phosphorus grenade thrown at or near a bunker created a distinctive plume that naval gunners could see instantly. The technique was brilliantly simple. The spotter would radio, target marked with white smoke, base of ridge, 100 yards north of the burnt tree. The gun captain would scan the ridge, locate the smoke, and engage. No coordinates, no mathematical calculations, just visual identification and direct fire. The colored smoke technique transformed close-range naval gunfire from an experimental tactic into a reliable system. By December 1944, every Marine rifle company had forward observers trained in marking targets for naval guns. Every destroyer had gun crews trained to engage smoke-marked positions. The coordination between ships and troops ashore reached a level of effectiveness that pre-war planners would have considered impossible, but the ultimate test was coming. In February 1945, American forces would assault Iwo Jima, an island so heavily fortified that intelligence estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders had constructed 18 miles of tunnels and hundreds of mutually supporting bunkers. The preliminary bombardment would last 3 days, the longest in the Pacific War, and for the first time, close-range direct fire would be the primary technique, not an experimental supplement. February 19th, 1945, 0600 hours. The naval bombardment of Iwo Jima reached its crescendo. 6 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers surrounded the tiny island, pouring fire into Japanese positions from every direction. But unlike previous operations where big ships fired from comfortable distances, the destroyers were working at ranges that made even experienced crews nervous. USS Leutze was operating at 700 yards from shore. USS Newcomb was at 850 yards. USS Bryant had closed to 600 yards, so close that Japanese soldiers could throw grenades at the ship if they had possessed arms that strong. The gun crews worked in a rhythm born of months of practice. Target marked by smoke. Gun captain identifies position. Aim. Fire. Observe. Impact. Adjust. Fire again. Confirm destruction. Move to next target. The 5-inch guns fired so rapidly that their barrels began to overheat. Crews rigged hoses to spray seawater on the guns between salvos, cooling the metal just enough to prevent warping. Some destroyers fired over 1,000 rounds in the first 6 hours, exhausting half their ammunition before the Marines even landed. The Japanese had prepared for long-range bombardment. Their bunkers had thick overhead protection designed to withstand 16-inch shells from battleships firing at maximum range. But they had not prepared for 5-inch guns firing directly into their firing ports from 800 yards. The flat trajectory at close range meant shells entered bunkers horizontally, striking interior walls and exploding inside the positions. Bunkers that could survive a near miss from a 1-ton battleship shell were destroyed by 25-kilogram destroyer shells placed precisely through their apertures. Lieutenant Benjamin Roselle, a Marine forward observer, watched the close-range bombardment from his position near the beach. He later described the experience as watching artillery fire from the ship's perspective. The destroyers were so close, I could see the gun crews working their weapons. When they fired, I could track the shells through the air and watch them impact exactly where we'd marked with smoke. It was the most precise fire support I ever witnessed. Those destroyer crews weren't just shooting at the island, they were surgically removing specific threats. But the price of that precision was measured in damaged ships and dead sailors. Japanese gunners, realizing they were being engaged at close range, began targeting the destroyers with every weapon capable of reaching them. 47mm anti-tank guns opened fire from concealed positions. 75mm field guns engaged over open sights. Even 25mm machine cannons joined the fight, their shells capable of penetrating destroyer hulls at close range. USS Leutzer took a direct hit from a 75mm gun at 0730 hours. The shell struck the bridge, killing 3 officers and wounding 5 sailors. Command shifted to the executive officer in secondary con, and Leutzer stayed on station, continuing to fire, even as damage control teams worked to stop flooding and treat casualties. The ship's gun crews never missed a beat, maintaining their rate of fire while their shipmates died 10 feet away. USS Pensacola, a heavy cruiser that had closed to 1,600 yards to engage targets that destroyers couldn't reach, was hit 17 times by shore batteries. 6 men were killed and 98 wounded. But Pensacola stayed on the gun line for 6 hours, her 8-inch guns systematically destroying bunkers and artillery positions. Her captain later reported that withdrawal would have meant abandoning Marines who were depending on naval gunfire to keep them alive. That was not an option any Navy captain would consider. The willingness to accept damage in exchange for effective fire support marked a fundamental shift in naval culture. Pre-war doctrine had prioritized ship preservation. Commanders were expected to withdraw if faced with shore batteries that could inflict serious damage. But by Iwo Jima, that calculus had reversed. Ships existed to support the troops ashore. If supporting the troops meant taking hits from shore batteries, then that was the price of doing business. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, made the policy explicit. Ships that withdrew from fire support duty without explicit orders faced immediate relief of command. The new doctrine created tension that no one wanted to discuss openly. Destroyer captains were expected to close to ranges where enemy fire was certain and damage was probable. But those same captains were also responsible for the lives of their 300 sailors. Balancing the mission requirements against crew safety required judgment calls that kept commanders awake at night. How close was close enough? When did acceptable risk become reckless endangerment? Where was the line between courage and foolishness? Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, captain of USS Heermann, found his line at Iwo Jima when a Marine forward observer requested fire on a bunker complex that was pinning down an entire rifle company. The bunkers were tucked into the base of Mount Suribachi at a location that could only be engaged from 600 yards offshore. At 600 yards, Heermann would be within range of every Japanese weapon on the island. Moosbrugger didn't hesitate. He brought his ship to 600 yards, positioned broadside to maximize the number of guns that could bear, and opened fire. Japanese gunners responded immediately. Shells bracketed Heermann from multiple directions. Machine gun fire swept the decks. A 47mm round struck the forward fire room but failed to penetrate to the boilers. For 12 minutes, Heermann traded fire with shore batteries, while her 5-inch guns systematically destroyed the bunker complex. When the last bunker collapsed, Moosbrugger ordered flank speed and withdrew through a wall of splashes from enemy shells. Heermann took 14 hits, but remained operational. The Marine Rifle Company advanced past the destroyed bunkers without losing a man. That engagement became the template for close-range naval gunfire at Iwo Jima. Destroyers would close to ranges measured in hundreds of yards, engage specific targets identified by forward observers, accept whatever damage resulted, and withdraw only after confirming target destruction. It was aggressive to the point of recklessness. It violated every pre-war doctrine about ship preservation, and it worked better than any fire support technique the Navy had ever employed. The statistics from Iwo Jima told the story. Naval gunfire destroyed an estimated 45% of Japanese fortifications before the Marines landed. Close-range direct fire accounted for the vast majority of confirmed bunker destructions. Battleships firing from 8,000 yards provided suppressive fire and destroyed large structures. Cruisers at 4,000 yards engaged area targets and artillery positions. But it was destroyers at 800 yards that killed the bunkers and pillboxes that would have slaughtered Marines on the beach. The human cost aboard the destroyers was significant. 8 ships took major damage from shore batteries. 42 sailors were killed and 117 wounded. But Marine casualties during the initial landing phase were 35% lower than projections based on previous island assaults. Every destroyer sailor who died at close range saved the lives of 3 or 4 Marines who would have been killed by bunkers those destroyers destroyed. The mathematics were cold but undeniable. The ultimate validation of close-range direct fire came at Okinawa in April 1945. The island was larger than any previous objective, with defending forces estimated at over 100,000 Japanese troops. The terrain was more complex, with ridges and caves that made target identification difficult. And the Japanese had learned from their defeats at Iwo Jima, positioning their heaviest weapons to engage ships that came too close to shore. The Navy deployed more destroyers for fire support at Okinawa than in any previous operation. 48 destroyers rotated through fire support stations, with 8 to 12 ships on the gun line at any time. Each destroyer was assigned to a specific Marine regiment, with forward observers from that regiment embarked aboard ship to coordinate fire. The integration between naval gunners and ground forces reached a level that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. USS Young, operating off the western beaches, spent 18 consecutive hours at ranges between 700 and 1,000 yards, engaging targets as fast as Marine spotters could identify them. Her gun crews fired 973 rounds, destroying 42 confirmed bunkers, 17 artillery positions, and countless smaller targets. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Julian Beckton, later described the experience as conducting fire support in a shooting gallery where the targets shot back. Beckton had developed a technique that other destroyer captains quickly adopted. Instead of positioning broadside to maximize guns on target, he kept Young bow-on to the beach, presenting the smallest possible target to enemy gunners, while still allowing his forward guns to engage. The ship would close to firing range, unleash a furious barrage from forward mounts, then reverse engines and back out to safe distance before shore batteries could respond. The entire engagement would last 3 to 5 minutes, just long enough to destroy the assigned targets, but not long enough for Japanese gunners to calculate a firing solution. The bow-on technique reduced damage to individual ships but required perfect coordination between the bridge and the gun crews. A misjudgment of range or timing could leave the ship exposed to enemy fire while trying to reverse engines. Several destroyers suffered damage when they stayed on station too long or misjudged the enemy's response time. USS Laffey was hit by shore batteries 7 times during a single engagement, suffering severe damage and 32 casualties. But the technique worked often enough that it became standard practice for destroyers engaging heavily defended positions. The Japanese response to close-range naval gunfire evolved throughout the Okinawa campaign. They began positioning their heaviest guns in positions where they could engage destroyers at point-blank range. They used camouflage and deception to hide artillery until ships came within killing range. They coordinated fire from multiple positions to bracket destroyers and prevent evasive maneuvering. The defenders had learned that American destroyers would get close, and they prepared to make getting close as dangerous as possible. USS William D. Porter discovered just how dangerous when she closed to 800 yards to engage bunkers near Naha. Japanese gunners had positioned a 75mm gun in a cave that overlooked the exact firing position destroyers needed to use to hit the bunkers. As Porter slowed to begin her fire mission, the hidden gun opened fire at 800 yards range. The first shell struck Porter's forward fire room, the second hit the bridge. The third penetrated the forward magazine. Porter survived only because her crew executed damage control with extraordinary skill, and her captain immediately ordered emergency speed to clear the kill zone. The incident demonstrated a hard truth about close-range direct fire. It was not a technique that could be executed casually or without risk. Every approach to the gun line had to be planned with the assumption that enemy gunners were waiting for ships to reach their most vulnerable position. Captains learned to vary their approach routes, to never use the same firing position twice, to constantly maneuver even while engaging targets. The psychological strain on destroyer crews operating at close range for extended periods became a serious concern. Sailors who had survived months of combat at sea found that operating at 800 yards from a hostile shore produced a unique kind of stress. You could see the enemy. You could watch their shells arcing toward your ship. You could count the seconds between enemy muzzle flash and shell impact. The experience was more like infantry combat than naval warfare, and it affected crews in ways that traditional sea battles didn't. Destroyer captains reported increased incidents of combat fatigue among gun crews after extended periods on the fire support line. Sailors who had performed flawlessly for months began making mistakes, missing targets they should have hit, freezing at critical moments. The Navy responded by rotating destroyers off the gun line every 3 to 4 days, giving crews time to recover before returning to close-range fire support duty. But some sailors never fully adapted to the experience of fighting at ranges where they could see the men trying to kill them. Yet, for all the stress and danger, destroyer crews developed an intense pride in their ability to provide effective fire support. They knew that Marines were alive because of shells they had placed precisely through bunker-firing ports. They knew that infantry companies had advanced because artillery positions they destroyed couldn't fire back. The connection between ship and shore was direct and personal in a way that long-range bombardment never achieved. Gun crews weren't firing at coordinates on a map. They were destroying specific threats to specific Marines whose lives depended on their accuracy. By May 1945, close-range direct fire had become the standard technique for naval gunfire support throughout the Pacific. Every destroyer captain knew how to bring his ship within 1,000 yards of a hostile shore and engage targets in local control. Every gun crew knew how to identify bunkers and hit firing ports from close range. Every Marine rifle company knew how to mark targets with smoke and call in naval gunfire with confidence that the shells would hit what they aimed at. The technique had evolved from Richard Connolly's desperate improvisation at Salerno to a systematic doctrine that saved thousands of lives. The evolution required overcoming institutional resistance to tactics that prioritized effectiveness over safety. It required gun crews to develop skills that had nothing to do with the fire control computers they had trained to use. It required destroyer captains to accept risks that pre-war doctrine would have condemned as reckless. But most of all, it required everyone involved to understand that ships existed to support the troops ashore, and that mission took precedence over everything else. The final measure of the doctrine's success came in the casualty statistics compiled after Okinawa. Marine and Army infantry divisions, supported by close-range naval gunfire, suffered 42% fewer casualties during amphibious assaults than forces in earlier campaigns supported by long-range bombardment. The difference translated to thousands of lives saved. Families who welcomed their sons and brothers home after the war never knew that a destroyer firing at 800 yards from a beach somewhere in the Pacific had kept those men alive. The irony was complete. The United States Navy had spent decades developing sophisticated fire control systems that could hit targets at 20,000 yards. They had built radar that could track ships through fog and darkness. They had created analog computers that could calculate trajectories while compensating for wind, roll, pitch, and target motion. All of that technology was designed to keep ships safe while engaging enemies at maximum range. And then the war taught them that the most effective way to destroy enemy fortifications was to ignore all that sophistication and shoot at things they could see with their eyes from ranges where the enemy could shoot back. The transformation wasn't about abandoning technology. The Mark 37 fire control system remained invaluable for anti-aircraft work and for engaging naval targets. Radar still provided critical information about range and bearing. Fire control computers still calculated ballistic solutions for long-range bombardment, but for the mission that mattered most, providing direct support to troops on the ground, the solution was visceral and primitive. Get close, see the target, shoot it, confirm it's destroyed. Move to the next target. That simplicity concealed the courage required to execute it. Every destroyer captain who brought his ship within 1,000 yards of a fortified beach knew he was exposing his crew to danger. Every gun captain who aimed his weapon by eye instead of computer was accepting personal responsibility for accuracy. Every sailor who stayed at his station, while enemy shells churned the water around his ship, was choosing mission over safety. The close-range direct fire doctrine worked because thousands of Navy sailors decided that getting it right mattered more than staying safe. The legacy extended beyond the Pacific War. When the Marine Corps assaulted Incheon in September 1950 during the Korean War, destroyers provided close-range fire support using techniques perfected at Peleliu and Okinawa. When American forces conducted amphibious operations in Vietnam, naval gunfire doctrine emphasized close-range direct fire over long-range bombardment. The lessons learned between Salerno and Okinawa became institutional knowledge that shaped how the Navy provided fire support for decades. But the human stories behind the doctrine faded from memory faster than the tactical lessons. The destroyer captains who brought their ships within range of shore batteries, the gun crews who fired at targets they could see with their eyes while enemy shells landed around them. The forward observers who marked targets with smoke while under fire. The Marines who advanced past destroyed bunkers, knowing that sailors they would never meet had died to make that advance possible. These individual acts of courage became statistics in after-action reports and eventually disappeared entirely from the historical record. Richard Connolly never commanded at close range again after his innovations at Salerno and Kwajalein. He went on to lead amphibious forces at Guam and later served as president of the Naval War College. His nickname, Close-in Connolly, followed him throughout his career as a reminder of the day he brought his command ship within 1,000 yards of German tanks and proved that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem was to get close enough to see it, clearly. He died in 1962 when the airliner carrying him and his wife crashed shortly after takeoff from New York. His legacy lived on in every destroyer, captain who brought his ship close to shore and engaged the enemy at ranges that made sense tactically, even if they seemed insane by every other measure. Commander Frederick Musbrugger, who had fought Heermann at 600 yards off Iwo Jima, survived the war and retired as a rear admiral. He never spoke publicly about the 12 minutes his ship spent trading fire with Japanese shore batteries. But members of the Marine Rifle Company that Heermann supported tracked him down years after the war and thanked him personally for the lives he saved. Musbrugger reportedly told them that he was simply doing what the mission required, getting close enough to make sure the job got done right. The evolution of naval gunfire support from long-range indirect bombardment to close-range direct fire represented a fundamental shift in how the Navy understood its role in amphibious operations. Ships were not floating artillery platforms that fired at coordinates and withdrew. They were integrated components of a combined arms team that included aircraft, artillery, armor, and infantry. When that team needed precision fire support, the Navy got close enough to provide it, regardless of risk. The mathematical elegance of the final solution was striking. Fire control systems could calculate trajectories for shells traveling 20,000 yards through complex atmospheric conditions. but they couldn't see a bunker firing port. The human eye could see the port, but couldn't calculate the trajectory. The answer was to eliminate the need for calculation by getting close enough that the trajectory didn't matter. At 800 yards, you aimed directly at the target and fired. The shell went where you pointed. That's all the calculation you needed. Close-range direct fire transformed what naval guns could accomplish ashore. Battleships remained valuable for destroying large structures and providing suppressive fire. Cruisers maintained their role engaging area targets and providing sustained bombardment. But destroyers became precision instruments for eliminating specific threats at specific moments. A bunker that needed to die before Marines could advance got a 5-inch shell through its firing port, delivered by sailors who could see the target and knew when they'd destroyed it. The price of that precision was measured in damaged ships, dead sailors, and captains who accepted risks that peacetime doctrine would have forbidden. But the alternative was measured in Marines dying on beaches because bunkers that looked destroyed from long range were still operational at ground level. When faced with that choice, destroyer captains chose to get close, and in making that choice, they saved thousands of lives and proved that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the simplest one. See the target, shoot the target, confirm it's dead, do it again. The dawn that broke over Peleliu on September 15th, 1944, illuminated a beach that should have been a killing ground. Marines landing on those beaches faced defenses that conventional wisdom said were impossible to neutralize, but they found destroyed bunkers instead of operational fortifications. They found silent artillery positions instead of guns firing into their landing craft. They found evidence that somebody had gotten close enough to do the job right. Destroyers steaming at 800 yards, gun crews aiming by eye, shells entering firing ports because the gun captain could see the target and put the crosshairs on it and fire. That was the revolution. Not better technology or bigger guns. Just sailors who decided that effective fire support mattered more than safe distances. Men who brought their ships close enough to see what they were shooting at and stayed there until the job was done. The forbidden technique became doctrine. The dangerous method became standard practice, and thousands of men came home from the war because destroyer crews had learned to fire without sights at ranges where doctrine said they shouldn't survive. The mathematics of courage cannot be calculated by machines, but the results can be measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. Close-range direct fire worked because people made it work, and that's the only calculation that ever mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.